This week's parshah, Vayeshev, contains one of the key events in the story of Genesis, the sale of Joseph into slavery in Egypt by his brothers. But when we investigate the Chumash, what we find is that things are not necessarily what they seem. And particularly, we have to ask the question, when exactly in the chronology of events in the Genesis story did the sale take place? The Torah tells us that Isaac was 60 years old when Jacob and Esau were born. And then the Torah also tells us that Isaac was 180 when he died. That means that Jacob must have been 120 at the time of his father's death. Now, the Torah also tells us that Joseph was 17 when he was sold into slavery, and that he is 30 when Pharaoh promotes him. Meaning the time that Joseph spent in slavery in Egypt, from the time he was sold by his brothers until he was elevated by Pharaoh to be the viceroy of the land, is a total of 13 years. Add to that the 7 years of plenty, and the first 2 years of famine, because it's in the second year that his brothers come down and Joseph's identity is revealed. And what you end up with is 22 years that Joseph was in the land of Egypt before his father came down and joined him. Now, when Jacob comes down to the land of Egypt, he has an audience with Pharaoh. And Pharaoh asks him, essentially, how old are you? And Jacob, in that verse, tells Pharaoh that he is 130 years old. 130 years minus the 22 years that Joseph had been in Egypt from the time that he was sold until Jacob comes down, leaves us 108 as Jacob's age at the time that Joseph was sold into slavery. And yet, if you look in the chronology of the Torah places Isaac's death in chapter 35 and places Joseph's sale in chapter 37. In other words, a person reading the Chumash on a surface level, not necessarily getting into the intricate math of everyone's ages, would be left with the impression that Isaac died before Joseph was sold into slavery. And yet we see from the verses of the Torah that in fact Isaac was alive for a full 12 years after Joseph had been sold into slavery. What's a person to make of all these discrepancies? Nachmanides suggests that it is the way of the Torah to wrap up a story before moving into the next story. And so, just as the story of Abraham was completely finished and wrapped up, including Abraham's death and burial and the listing of all of his descendants, not only Yitzchak but also Ishmael, so too here, Isaac's death is wrapped up, and his burial and all of the listing of his descendants through Esau's line, before we move into the next phase, which really focuses on Jacob and his children, and particularly the story of Joseph's descent into Egypt, his faith in his suffering, and his eventual rise. And I think for us too, the lesson we can take from this is to really think about what we have going on. So many of us have complicated lives with a lot of different projects that we have working on. And the Torah suggests to us here that there is a value from time to time in focusing in on completing one thing, on finishing one project, one task, one idea that we're working on, so that we can then devote our attention truly and fully to the next thing. Shabbat Shalom.